There's audio circulating right now, audio that allegedly captures the final moments of the Greg Biffle citation crash. Millions have heard it. Major aviation channels have amplified it. But here's what almost nobody is asking. Where did it come from? And here's the bigger question. Why is the NTSB pretending it doesn't exist? I'm back with another deep dive, and today we're looking at an accident where the silence is louder than the evidence, because what's not being said might be more important than what is. Stay with me on this one, because by the end of this video, you're going to understand why this crash matters far beyond the 3 people who died, and why the way information is being handled right now should concern every single person who cares about aviation safety. Let me set the scene for you. February 2025, Statesville, North Carolina, about 30 miles north of Charlotte, a Cessna Citation 2 departs runway 10 at 10:05 in the morning. 10 minutes later, it crashes 1,800 feet short of runway 28 during an attempted emergency return. 3 people on board. All 3 were pilots. All 3 died. The weather, technically legal VFR, but barely. Ceilings at 1,200 feet, visibility 5 miles, drizzle. The kind of day where you're legal to fly, but you're also asking for trouble if anything goes wrong. And something did go wrong. Now, if you've been following this story, you've probably seen the post-crash photos. Juan Brown over at Blanco Lirio noticed it first. The right-hand nose baggage door appears to be missing. And the right engine? Fan blades are mangled. That combination should sound familiar if you've been paying attention to citation accidents over the years. In 2024, just last year, a Citation 2 taking off from Barranquilla, Colombia, had its nose baggage door pop open right after liftoff. Items got sucked out of the compartment and straight into the number 2 engine. Engine failed. The crew managed to limp back and land on one engine. They survived. But go back to 2007, and another Citation crew wasn't so lucky. Their baggage door opened after takeoff. The noise, the chaos, the distraction, they got so fixated on it that they stalled the aircraft and crashed. Everyone died. Here's the kicker that most people don't understand about these older Citation models. These baggage doors have no cockpit indication, none. There's no light, no warning, no chime. If someone forgets to latch it, you won't know until it's flapping in the wind at 150 knots. That's a massive human factors failure. One mistake, one distraction, one person thinking someone else checked it, and you're in an emergency. This is the kind of design that modern aviation has moved away from precisely because it relies entirely on human perfection, and humans are not perfect. And in this case, there were 3 pilots on board. So who was responsible for checking that door? Was it the pilot in command? Was it whoever loaded the baggage? Was it the person who closed up the airplane before departure? With 3 pilots, you'd think someone would have caught it, but that's actually part of the problem. When you have multiple people who could do something, sometimes nobody does it because everyone assumes someone else already did. It's called diffusion of responsibility, and it's a well-documented psychological phenomenon that has caused accidents before. This is where things get really complicated, and I need you to pay close attention because the crew composition on this flight raises serious questions about whether this operation was even legal. The pilot in command was Dennis Dutton, 67 years old, former Delta captain, holds a citation type rating. Solid credentials on paper. This is a guy who flew heavy jets for a major airline, so he clearly knew what he was doing in terms of technical flying ability. But here's the thing that matters from a regulatory standpoint. Dennis required a qualified second in command to fly this aircraft. Now, also on board was Greg Biffle himself. NASCAR legend, owns the airplane, multi-engine rated pilot. He could legally serve as second in command if he'd met the familiarization requirements under FAR 6155. This regulation allows someone without a type rating to act as second in command in Part 91 operations, as long as they've received proper familiarization training and met certain landing currency requirements. Given that Biffle owned the plane and had invested heavily in getting multiple ratings, it's completely reasonable to assume he intended to eventually fly it himself with Dennis as the experienced mentor, probably also to satisfy insurance requirements, which typically demand a certain amount of turbine time before they'll let you fly solo. But there's a third person on board, and this is where the red flags start waving. Jack Dutton, Dennis's son, a junior in Auburn University's professional flight program, by all accounts a good kid working hard toward a career in aviation. And here's where the regulations get crystal clear. Jack held only a single engine private pilot certificate with a fresh instrument rating, no multi-engine rating, no type rating, no citation experience whatsoever. So legally, Jack couldn't serve as second in command under any interpretation of the regulations. He simply didn't meet the requirements. But put yourself in Dennis's shoes for a second. Your son is pursuing a professional pilot career. You're flying a twin engine jet. The temptation to put him in the right seat, to give him that experience, that memory, to let him see what it's like to fly a real jet would be enormous. I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm saying it's a very human temptation, and we need to acknowledge that possibility because it matters for understanding what might have unfolded in that cockpit. We don't know for sure who was sitting where. The public doesn't know, the media doesn't know, but the NTSB does, and this is important. This aircraft had a cockpit voice recorder installed from its previous Part 135 operations. And CVRs aren't required for Part 91 flights, but this one had been operating commercially before Biffle bought it, and the recorder was still there, still working, still recording. The NTSB has that recorder. They've already listened to it. They know exactly who was flying. They know who was in the left seat and who was in the right seat. They know whose voice is on that viral audio clip. And they're choosing not to tell us, which brings us to the elephant in the room that we need to address head on. Now let's talk about that audio, because this is where things get really interesting from an information integrity standpoint. Several days after the crash, a recording surfaced online. It allegedly captures transmissions from the accident flight. VACE Aviation picked it up, a channel known for publishing ATC audio. It went viral. It spread across aviation forums, Reddit, Twitter, everywhere. And almost nobody stopped to ask the most basic journalistic question: is this real? Where did it come from? There's no chain of custody, no verified source, no live ATC timestamp. It just appeared. Now, normally when something dramatic happens on frequency, it gets captured by live ATC or one of the many feed providers out there, and it goes viral within hours. This didn't. This surfaced days later with no clear origin story, and that should have been an immediate red flag for anyone trained in source verification. But here's the thing, and this is where it gets technically interesting. Analysis of the audio suggests it's genuine. Not just genuine in terms of content, but genuine in terms of technical characteristics. The noise floor, the static patterns, the VHF bandwidth, it's all consistent with actual aviation radio, not a studio fake or a recreation. There are no echoes, no room tone, no phase artifacts you'd get from recording a speaker with a phone or playing audio through a speaker and capturing it with a microphone. Whoever recorded this had direct access to VHF aviation frequencies, which means either they were in an aircraft, at an airport with a radio, or using a scanner. That's not the kind of thing your average internet hoaxer has access to or knows how to fake convincingly. And there's another detail that's even more compelling from a technical authentication standpoint. Toward the end of the transmission, the audio degrades, and it degrades in exactly the way it would if the aircraft was losing line of sight with the ground antenna due to extremely low altitude. The signal doesn't just cut out cleanly, it deteriorates with increasing static and breakup, which is precisely what happens when you're getting into terrain masking. Then immediately after, you hear what sounds like an FBO worker or airport operations person announcing that the airport is closed. That transmission is crystal clear, much higher quality than the aircraft transmission because it's coming from someone on the ground, probably right next to the radio they're using to transmit. The quality difference between the two transmissions is exactly what you'd expect if one was from a low altitude aircraft at the edge of radio range and the other was from a ground station. Those kinds of details are nearly impossible to fake unless you really know what you're doing and have access to the right equipment, which makes a hoax unlikely, but not impossible. For that reason, I don't believe it's fabricated, but I'm also not 100% convinced of its provenance without official confirmation. And that's a perfectly reasonable position to hold when you're dealing with unverified material in a fatal accident investigation. Let me read you part of what's allegedly on that recording because the content itself raises questions. The voice says something like, "We're getting everything going, we're getting our gear down." Now, that's odd phrasing. Lowering the landing gear is a routine task. Pilots don't usually broadcast that over CTAF unless they're responding to someone asking about their configuration or they're doing it as part of a standardized position report, but we don't hear the other side of any conversation. The transmission feels one-sided, like maybe there was a back and forth happening that wasn't captured, or maybe the pilot was just talking to manage their own stress, which does happen in high workload situations. The voice also repeatedly mentions an issue without specifying what it is. In real Mayday calls, pilots usually say exactly what's wrong: engine failure, fire, hydraulic failure, loss of pressurization. Specificity helps controllers and other aircraft understand the nature of the emergency and what kind of assistance might be needed. But if your baggage door just blew open and your right engine is eating luggage and you're not entirely sure what's happening because you've never experienced this before and it's not in your emergency checklist, maybe you're not sure what to call it yet. Maybe issue is the best word you can come up with in the moment when your brain is trying to process multiple failures simultaneously. And here's what everyone who's heard this audio is noticing: the voice sounds young. Not definitively, not provably, but it has a quality that doesn't sound like a 67-year-old former airline captain. If that voice belongs to Jack Dutton, it raises massive questions. Was he in the right seat? Was he actually manipulating the controls? And if so, was this operation even legal under Part 91? Because even if he was just sitting there, if he was the one making radio calls during an emergency, that suggests he was taking an active role in the flight, which brings us back to the question of crew qualification and whether proper procedures were being followed. These aren't just academic questions, they matter for understanding how the accident unfolded and what human factors were at play. Let me show you why the NTSB's handling of this matters, because this is about more than just one accident. In the first NTSB press briefing, which happened pretty quickly after the crash, spokesperson Michael Graham was asked directly if the crew had declared an emergency. His response? He said something to the effect of, "We're not aware of any emergency declaration at this time." Now, you could interpret that charitably. Maybe he hadn't listened to all the audio yet. Maybe he was being cautious about what he said publicly. But by the second briefing, which happened the next day, Graham corrected himself. He acknowledged that a family member on board had sent a text message saying they were making an emergency landing. So clearly there was awareness of an emergency, at least among the occupants of the aircraft. Okay, fine. Investigations evolve. Information comes in. I get that. But here's what's really weird, and this is what jumped out at me when I watched both briefings back to back. In that second briefing, Graham never mentioned audio once, not even in his appeal to the public for more information. In the first briefing, he specifically mentioned audio recordings, plural, multiple times. He talked about how they were collecting audio, how they were reviewing transmissions, how important audio evidence was to the investigation. But once that viral audio started circulating online, once people started asking questions about it, suddenly the word audio disappeared from his vocabulary. In the second briefing, it was all about the cockpit voice recorder, flight data, wreckage examination, witness statements, but nothing about radio transmissions, nothing about communications with other aircraft or ground stations. I reached out to the NTSB directly. I sent a media inquiry asking if they could confirm or deny the authenticity of the audio that's making the rounds online. I wasn't asking for details about what's on their cockpit voice recorder. I wasn't asking for confidential investigation information. I was simply asking, is this thing that millions of people have heard actually from your accident, or is it from something else? It's a yes or no question. No response, radio silence. And that's a choice. Now, look, I completely understand that the NTSB doesn't owe YouTubers or independent journalists a play-by-play of their investigation. Investigations take time. They need to be thorough. They need to be done right, not fast. But there's a difference between withholding investigative details and actively avoiding a direct question that everyone in the aviation community is asking. Because here's the thing, they have the cockpit voice recorder. They've had it since day one. They know what was said in that cockpit. They know who said it. They know if that viral audio matches what's on the CVR. They could very easily say, we're aware of audio circulating online. We're examining all audio sources as part of our investigation without compromising anything. But they're choosing not to. And that choice is creating an information vacuum that speculation and potentially misinformation rushes in to fill. All right, let's talk about what the aircraft actually did, because the flight data tells its own story, even though it's frustratingly incomplete. Flight Radar 24 captured only 24 ADS-B data points across a 10-minute flight. Think about that for a second. Modern ADS-B systems broadcast position information every second or so. When conditions are good, we should have hundreds of data points. Instead, we have 24. The first 23 points cover just 2.5 minutes of flight time. Then there's a 4-minute gap where we have absolutely nothing. Then one final data point about 30 seconds before impact. That's a massive hole in our understanding of what the aircraft was doing during the most critical phase of the emergency. ADS-B exchange, which archives unfiltered data that Flight Radar 24 sometimes excludes because it fails certain validity checks, shows a much messier track, wild altitude swings, erratic climbs and descents, data points that seem to show the aircraft climbing at 4,000 feet per minute to 4,000 feet, then plummeting back down. Some people, like Captain Steve and others who've analyzed this, have speculated about a possible flight control issue or even a struggle in the cockpit based on those altitude excursions. But here's the more likely explanation, and this is where understanding how ADS-B works becomes really important. Line of sight problems. ADS-B is a radio system. It requires line of sight between the aircraft and ground receiving stations. When you're flying low over rolling terrain, especially in reduced visibility with potential precipitation affecting signal propagation, ground stations lose contact. When they regain contact, the altitude data, it can be corrupted or interpolated incorrectly. The wild altitude swings we see in the unfiltered data are almost certainly artifacts of poor signal quality and gaps in coverage, not actual aircraft maneuvers. Flight Radar 24 filters out data points that don't make physical sense based on their algorithms, which is why their track looks cleaner but has huge gaps. So what can we actually trust from the data we have? The cleanest data points we have show this sequence. The aircraft climbed normally after takeoff, which is consistent with both engines operating properly at that phase of flight. Around 2,000 feet, it leveled off and the airspeed started decreasing. Now that's significant because it means thrust was reduced. Pilots don't reduce thrust during a normal climb out unless something is wrong or they're complying with noise abatement procedures, but there are no noise abatement procedures that would apply at 2,000 feet over rural North Carolina. So something happened that caused the crew to reduce power. The aircraft then descended for about 90 seconds, losing a few hundred feet of altitude while the airspeed continued to decay. Then, and this is really interesting, it climbed again. It gained 350 feet in about 20 seconds, while simultaneously accelerating 19 knots. That climb rate works out to roughly 1,000 feet per minute, which is consistent with single-engine climb performance for a Citation II. But here's what's interesting, the simultaneous acceleration. If you're climbing on one engine in a light twin, you're typically not accelerating at the same time. You're using all available performance just to maintain the climb. The fact that the aircraft was both climbing and accelerating suggests both engines might still have been producing thrust at that point, or at least the remaining engine was producing more than just enough thrust to maintain altitude. Post-crash NTSB imagery that's been released shows significant foreign object damage to the right engine fan blades. The blades are bent, twisted, damaged in ways that indicate they hit something. When the NTSB tears down that engine, which they will as part of the standard investigation process, they'll be able to determine whether that damage resulted from tree strikes at impact or from baggage ingestion following a possible nose baggage door opening. Those two scenarios create different types of damage patterns. Tree strikes at impact speed create certain signatures. Ingesting soft materials like luggage or clothing creates different signatures. The metallurgy and damage progression will tell the story. Regardless of when the damage occurred, the aircraft's initial climb after takeoff appears completely consistent with both engines operating normally. If the baggage door was unsecured, and we don't know for certain that it was, it likely would have opened as the nose pitched up during the climb, creating a low pressure area over the forward fuselage that would literally suck the door open against its hinges. Depending on how the compartment was loaded and what was in there, there could have been a delay of seconds or even a minute before any item actually departed the compartment and got ingested by the right-hand engine. Or maybe the scenario didn't occur at all and we're chasing the wrong theory entirely. These are questions that should be resolved in the preliminary report, which we're expecting within the next week or two. Weather was technically VMC, visual meteorological conditions, but barely so. Low ceilings, drizzle, marginal visibility. And here's something that's not getting enough attention in the coverage I've seen. The crew was not in contact with ATC. We know this because if they had been on an IFR flight plan or receiving VFR flight following Controllers would have provided vectors, altitude assignments, traffic advisories, and most importantly for an emergency return, an instrument approach with vertical and lateral guidance. Instead, the flight path data suggests they were navigating visually on their own, probably trying to keep the airport in sight while dealing with whatever emergency they were facing. This is what we call scud running in aviation, flying below the clouds, trying to maintain visual contact with the ground. And it's one of the biggest killers in general aviation year after year. When you combine scud running with an in-flight emergency and an underqualified crew, you're stacking holes in the Swiss cheese faster than you can count them. The initial climb and turn after takeoff appear completely normal. At 2,000 feet, altitude stabilizes and airspeed begins to decay, indicating thrust reduction. That's the first sign that something is wrong. The aircraft then descends and slows for roughly 90 seconds, stabilizes briefly near 1,500 feet, continues southwest, then resumes a climb and acceleration. After that point, the data deteriorates so badly that we can't reliably say what happened. Either the aircraft executed a dramatic climb to 4,000 feet, which seems physically implausible given the performance characteristics and the situation, or ADS-B reception was lost due to terrain masking, and the altitude data became corrupted, which is far more likely. The final reliable data point places the aircraft low and abeam the airport on what appears to be a base leg for runway 28 seconds before impact short of the runway threshold. From that point to impact was probably less than 30 seconds, which means the crew had almost no time to recognize they were too low, add power, and execute a go-around if they even had the engine performance available to do so. At the end of the day, this accident does not hinge on a single dramatic failure, like an engine exploding or a wing falling off. It hinges on margins and how thin they can become when several small things line up at once. A baggage door that may or may not have been latched properly, a human factors design flaw that provides no warning if it isn't, a single pilot exemption that may or may not have applied to the pilot in command, raising questions about whether he was legal to fly without a properly qualified second in command, a second seat potentially occupied by someone who may or may not have been legally or practically capable of helping during an emergency. And if that person was making radio calls, it suggests they were actively involved in trying to manage the situation. Whether that was technically legal but completely unforgiving, the kind of weather where if anything goes wrong, you have very few options and very little room to work with. A jet climbing away from the ground with very little time, very little altitude, and very little room for error. None of those factors alone would be enough to bring down a citation to. These are good airplanes. They've been flying for decades. They have a solid safety record overall. But aviation accidents rarely happen one failure at a time. They happen when normal operations quietly drift toward the edge, when small compromises accumulate, when people make decisions that are maybe not quite by the book, but seem reasonable in the moment, until something unexpected happens and suddenly demands more than the system or the crew can give back. The audio that surfaced may eventually prove authentic, and I personally believe it probably is based on the technical analysis, or it may fade away as an artifact with no verifiable origin if the NTSB never acknowledges it. The ADS-B data may turn out to be noisy, filter, incomplete, or misleading, which it clearly is in several segments of the flight. The baggage door theory may end up being completely irrelevant if the investigation finds something else entirely. But the cockpit voice recorder will not be ambiguous. The CVR will have the whole story. The NTSB already knows who was flying. They know which pilot was sitting in which seat. They know when the tone in that cockpit changed from routine to urgent. They know what checklists were or weren't run. They know if there was confusion about who was doing what. And when the preliminary report is released, probably within the next 2 weeks, it will either close some doors or open others that many people aren't expecting. Until then, the most important lesson here isn't about doors, data, or decibels. It's about discipline. It's about structure. And it's about understanding that regulations don't create safety, training, and margins do. Because when the weather is low and the workload is high and something goes wrong just after liftoff, there is no room for ambiguity, no room for casual compliance, no room for someone sitting in a critical seat who doesn't have the training, the experience, or the legal qualifications to be there. Aviation is unforgiving of uncertainty. It doesn't care about good intentions. It doesn't care that you were trying to give your son a cool experience or that you thought the weather was good enough or that you were pretty sure someone checked that baggage door. It only cares about physics and margins, and sometimes it takes only 10 minutes to prove how little margin you actually had. If you found this analysis valuable, make sure you're subscribed because we'll be following up as soon as that preliminary report drops. Drop a comment. Let me know what you think. Do you believe the audio is real? Do you think the NTSB is being appropriately cautious? Or are they stonewalling? And if you're a pilot, do yourself a favor. Next time you close that baggage door, check it twice. Because in aviation, there's no such thing as a small mistake. Fly safe out there.